I must start by confessing that it's quite strange for me to be up on the stage and not in my usual speechwriter position, which is hovering somewhere at the back of the room, nervously chewing my fingers and tutting as some speaker mangulates my carefully prepared text. And so being up here, it's kind of like the roles are reversed, and I feel a little bit like Einstein's chauffeur. And I don't know whether any of you know the story, but Einstein in the 1920s, when he was going all over the place, telling people about the theory of relativity, and he was going to one venue, and his chauffeur was driving him, and his chauffeur said, "Oh, I've heard you deliver this bloody speech so many times now. I swear I could deliver it word for word myself." And Einstein, with a kind of mischievous wink, said, "Okay, why not? You go and you deliver it." And so Einstein stood at the back of the auditorium and watched as his chauffeur delivered his kind of stock speech absolutely word for word. But then, of course, the professor that was introducing him said, "Thank you very much, Professor Einstein. That was splendid, as always. And now, any questions?" At which point, someone in the audience asked an incredibly complex and convoluted question. And the driver paused for just the blink of an eye, and then he said, "That sounds like a very intelligent question, very complicated, very convoluted, but in fact the answer to it is so simple, even my driver knows it." And so thank you very much to Ros and the Henley team for bringing us down to this cellar. From the glamour of Henley, we've sunk deep into. I always feel, I was saying to Mark Swain earlier, it kind of feels like you're stepping back into Dickensian London when you come back here, and it makes me think of Henry Mayhew and Charles Dickens and all of that lot who shone a light on poverty and the grime that was running throughout London throughout the 19th century. And in a sense, this is what I want to do tonight. I want to shine a spotlight on an area of business language which is never ever talked about. We all know all of the mantras of business communication, always write in the active voice, avoid cliches, avoid the passive voice, always tell stories, all of this kind of stuff, and no one ever talks about metaphors. And yet metaphors, to me, are almost the most important piece of language. And invariably, when you look at a sentence, it is the metaphor that is the most important part of the sentence, because it's the metaphor that has the image in it. It's the metaphor that sets the frame. It's the metaphor that sets the tone. And it's ever so important. And I don't remember ever really much learning about this. I did A-level English at school, and I don't remember my teacher ever mentioning it. He was an extraordinary man, a guy called Cedric German, who was in his early 50s, and he had, I kid you not, he had a colostomy bag, which we used to watch, all of these schoolboys used to watch in the lesson as it gradually got bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was such a shame, because he taught us about Chaucer, he taught us about Shakespeare, he taught us about Virginia Woolf, and he never taught us about metaphor. And it was really disappointing, because if he had have done, I'd have understood that the colostomy bag was actually a metaphor for the education, which he was filling us with. And so what is metaphor? The basic formula for a metaphor is X equals Y. And so if I say I'm feeling down, then the metaphor that's going on there is down equals bad. Or if I say that I'm at a crossroads, the X to Y is that life is a journey. Or if you say X, if you say he's very bright, the X to Y is that light is intelligence. Metaphors are all around us. We use metaphors about once every 20 words on average, although it varies depending on the kind of context that we're in. So this is about 6 times a minute, 7 times a minute. And these are invariably the most important parts of the word. The sentence, we use metaphors when we want to illuminate a difficult issue, and perhaps it might be an abstract topic, perhaps not, but also they have another quality, which is that they persuade people, because the very act of using a metaphor invites people to see things from our perspective. So to give you an example, I might say to you that our conversation is littered with metaphors. But this is a bad metaphor to use, isn't it? Because the x equals y that I'm using there is that metaphors are rubbish. And I don't actually believe that. So a better metaphor might be if I say our speech is scattered with metaphors. And I like that one because metaphors are like seeds which you plant in people's fertile minds and then which might grow out and they might blossom. But if they get carried away, then you might need to step in and prune them back. And so this is working. This is a metaphorical frame which has some sense in it. And in fact, it's an idea which exists, is actually embedded in dictionaries in our language. The very word propaganda is a word that is built on this metaphor to propagate. And so you find this as well, that metaphors are all over the place, even within words. Orwell famously wrote about dead metaphors, metaphors that have been overused to the point that they're dead. And I'm not actually sure there's any such thing as a metaphor, even a metaphor that has been overused time and time and time again. It still has a little something in it. It's still going to activate just a little germ of an idea within you. And the thing that makes metaphors so powerful is because it's all unconscious. Metaphors rise up from your unconscious as you are speaking, and then they settle themselves in other people's unconscious minds. And this is why they're so powerful, and this is why we don't notice them as well. Look at history. You can actually tell the history of the world through metaphors, starting off with the Cold War and going through the Iron Curtain and the Wind of Change and the Swinging 60s and the Winter of Discontent and the Iron Lady, all the way through. And every single one of these ideas will have accepted, will have been taught them at school, but we might not have paused to think, well, hang on a sec, this is a metaphor. What's it loaded with? What are we actually getting with that metaphor? Let me just give you an example. The Iron Curtain. Well, iron, what is it? It's cold, steely, hard, unemotional. Curtain, what does a curtain do? Well, a curtain literally shuts out light, and of course light is good and darkness is bad, as anyone who's a filmmaker knows. Whenever they want to show you who the bad guys are and who the good guys are, they sort the lighting out to reflect that. So you've got those two metaphors going in, and then the whole phrase, Iron Curtain. This has become somewhat lost in time, but certainly at the time that Churchill said this, in 1948, people knew the Iron Curtain as the metal screen that comes down in theatres, the fire safety curtain. And so it was playing into another metaphor, the theatre of war, in which Churchill and Truman and all the rest of them were actors upon the world stage. And so you see all of the ideas contained just within those two words, that it's just seeping into your unconscious and shaping your mood and shaping the way that you feel about it. Take another one, the Wind of Change. And this is a metaphor that you've probably heard at some point in a business context. There's no doubt been a wind of change blowing through the corridors of your company at some time or other. Probably several winds at one time, some good, some leave you possibly a bit like this. What was Harold Macmillan saying when he talked about a wind of change sweeping across the continent of Africa? Well, what he was saying was African nationalism is a force of nature. It's therefore unstoppable. There's nothing we can do about it because we understand that about nature. It's unstoppable. And so by doing that, he was putting the British people in a frame of mind which made them think there's nothing we can do about this. And so the British Empire, it's extraordinary really when you think about it, over a period of about 20 years, the whole British Empire was dismantled. And there wasn't really any hue and cry about it. It was scarcely a political issue. It just happened. But this was because people were put into that frame of mind. Harold Macmillan had nicely framed the debate about it through this metaphor. Charles de Gaulle, president of France at the same time, and he viewed this whole process completely differently. And so he thought African nationalism was stoppable, and indeed he wanted to stop it, and he wanted to rouse support for other people to stop it. And so the metaphor which he used was the metaphor X equals Y, insurgents as vermin. Because, of course, what do we want to do with vermin? we have to exterminate them. And so he was putting people into that frame of mind. So you see the vermin metaphor. Whenever you see anyone using it, and God forbid, particularly you see anyone using it against you, you've got to run a mile. This is a dangerous metaphor. It's why the mafia talk about rats. You know, it's putting people into that frame of mind. And indeed, you look at genocides throughout history. You look in Nazi Germany, and Hitler talks about the Jews as snakes or as fleas in that frame. You look at Rwanda in the 90s, and the Who's Who talked about the Tutsi as cockroaches. And more recently, you see this in the way that the press reports Islamic extremism. And so they talk about hunting them down, trapping them, their lairs. And I studied propaganda in my master's, and so I'm always very cynical about what comes out in wars. And I find it absolutely extraordinary that all of the big three baddies of the last 15 years, Osama bin Laden, Colonel Gaddafi, and Saddam Hussein, all of them were found in conditions which you would typically expect to find vermin. And so Saddam Hussein famously was found in a hole. Colonel Gaddafi was found in a pipe. And Osama bin Laden, okay, he was in the compound, but for 10 years before that, we'd been led to believe that he was in caves where you'd imagine to find all sorts of creepy crawlies. And so you see how this kind of thing just shapes people's feeling. And so we're a civilized nation, we're opposed to capital punishment, and we believe in international justice. And yet when all of those big three baddies were subjected to the most gruesome murders, really, particularly in Colonel Gaddafi's case, and it's visible on YouTube, no one batted an eyelid. And so this is the most horrific way that metaphors can be used. Where do these metaphors come from? I mentioned they come from the unconscious, and this is an important point, because I'm not suggesting for a second that someone like Harold Macmillan will have sat with his spin doctors, if they had spin doctors in the early 60s. They probably didn't. It was a far more noble age, wasn't it? And actually plotted this metaphor and thought, this is what we need to use. Wind of change is the one that's going to win the people over. Rather, it was something that he actually believed and strongly believed. And so that set the frame that he used to talk about, and therefore impressed that frame upon other people. And you do see this in people. As a speech writer, I need to understand different people's views on the world. No one has the same view on the world. And of course, if I write for someone in one metaphor, when they see the world a completely different way, then that person's just going to look at the speech, and he might not be able to articulate exactly what the problem is with it, but he'll just say, it's just not me. It's very well written, but it's just not me. It doesn't feel right. Or I don't see things like that. And so getting into people's metaphorical frames can be a very important way of understanding where it is that they're coming from. I did a piece of research in the run-up to the 2010 general election, which was looking at the different languages of the three big parties. And I analysed an absolute pile of speeches, literally went through 100,000 words delivered by all of the main politicians in all of the three main parties. And it was grueling and tiring and absolutely appalling for the poor student who I got to do it. But it revealed some incredible differences between the three parties. So Labour's main metaphor was that of war or conflict. And they used it twice as often as the other two parties, which is a massive difference. It's a massive difference. So talking about fighting challenges and attacking and confronting and defending and all of this sort of language. And it was very strong and very obvious. And the difference was far more pronounced in Brown, the leader, than it became as you went down further down the troops as well. And this makes sense, doesn't it, for the Labour Party? Because the Labour Party is a party born from revolution. They're formed in the working class struggle, and they believe that you have to fight for change. And so you can see something in the history of the party, the values of the party, and the philosophy of the party coming through in that metaphor. The Lib Dems, their main metaphor was journey metaphors, which they used twice as often as the other two parties. And so they might talk about our direction or being at a crossroads, a fork in the roads. And again, this is a natural metaphor for a party which claims to hold the mantle of progressive politics. And indeed, this is a feature of language which you often find in those kind of progressive politicians. And so, like, for instance, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Tony Blair as well used to use these kind of journey metaphors. And you see it going back in history. People like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and of course Nelson Mandela, whose book was The Road to Freedom. Then the Tories use nature metaphors twice as often as the other two parties. And so they would talk about planting seeds. They would also often use bodily metaphors, and so they'd talk about the heart of our communities. One of my favourite quotes from David Cameron is, Labour see the NHS as a machine full of levers. We don't. We see it as a living, breathing organism. You see what he's done there? He's explicitly articulated the metaphors. And so I thought, wow, that's really interesting, the different metaphors that comes across. But then you see it in the brands as well, don't you? It's not just something you notice in conversation with people from those parties. You see the Tories have the tree, obviously, nature. The Lib Dems have the dove, journey. And Labour, well, Labour's quite interesting because the red flag of revolution is still their symbol. They still sing the red flag at the end of every conference, but they moved to the red rose. And of course, they moved to the red rose when Peter Mandelson was Director of Communications, and his explicit and articulated strategy was to get like the Tories, to sound like the Tories, to start stealing some of their language. And so you see what was going on there. So that's the kind of insights that you get into where people are coming from. And these metaphors are really incredibly influential. And a lot of the time, you find in all sorts of fields of life, whoever it is that has the best metaphor is the one that wins the argument. And so if you go to Waterstones today and you have a look at the top business books that everyone's reading at the moment, they're almost all metaphors. You get nudge and blink and tipping points. Look at the newspapers, the way the newspapers will subtly introduce metaphors, the metaphor generally being that the world is a circus and politicians are like clowns or walking, tight ropes, all winding up with custard pie in their face. And this is just making gentle suggestions to you. Look at philosophy, the philosopher emerging, blinking from the cave. Look at science, mirror neurons, or Frankenstein foods. These are all metaphors. And of course, look at religion, from darkness to light. But let me just zoom in on one which is probably most relevant to us here, which is in economics, that probably the most influential two thinkers in economics over the last 300 years, 250 years, Adam Smith and Karl Marx. And both of them were articulating ideas that a lot of other people were articulating at the time, but they just did it much better than other people. And so you have Karl Marx with metaphor, the old tombstone in Highgate Cemetery, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. These were not literal chains, they were metaphorical chains. And then you have Adam Smith, on the other hand, with what must be one of the most quoted lines in history about the invisible hand of the market. And this is just an exquisite line, isn't it? Because wrapped up in it, he's managing to disarm his opponents, the main opponents' argument against his kind of laissez-faire economics, which is that, fine, markets might be all efficient and all of that, but they're cruel, they don't have feelings. And so he's saying, the invisible hand of the market, he's suggesting that the market is a person. And of course, we know that people have feelings, and so he was managed to convey this idea to people at an unconscious level. And Adam Smith knew what he was doing. He was not an accidental rhetorician. You can actually read online lectures which he gave on rhetoric, not on economics. He gave about 5 lectures on rhetoric at Glasgow University, and they're fascinating, absolutely fascinating, where he talks explicitly about metaphor, and about the way that it shouldn't, I think the line is, it shouldn't just be a thing of beauty. It needs to be a thing which is strong and which is striking. And so you notice the metaphorical imagery which he himself is using when talking about metaphor. Well, who cares? Who cares if I use a metaphor, if other people use a metaphor? Well, it matters, because the chances are if I use a metaphor, you're going to play it back to me. This is what happens in language anyway. People, we all do it. And so for instance, if I talk about a sofa as a sofa, then you'll call it a sofa. If I call a couch, then you'll call it a couch. Or if I call tea, you'll call it tea. If you dinner, and so on like that. And this is something which matters particularly when you get to metaphor, because it really does, it has a major impact on the way that people behave. There was the most incredible research carried out a few years ago that was looking at how people are motivated to buy shares or have confidence in whether or not shares are going up and down, likely to go up and down, what they call expectancy bias. Forgive me, I'll try and make sure that's the one bit of jargon I used tonight, expectancy bias. And it was looking at the metaphors that were used, which would make people think this share is going to rise or make it go down. And there was an extraordinary difference if people were talking about the share as if it were a living being. And so if they said, oh, today shares in whatever company it is, shares in Apple leapt, or they climbed, or they jumped, then people would believe, oh, it's going to carry on doing that. Because, of course, if the idea is planted in your minds, well, it's a person, then we understand people have purpose. And so if it's climbed, it won't have done so by accident. It will have done so for a reason, because there's something at the top it's trying to get to. And so we'll believe it will continue going up. If we used another metaphor, a non-living metaphor, and so if we said, for instance, it was propelled higher, well, what happens with helicopters? They're going to need to refuel at some point. Or, my own favourite, well, it bounced. And what happens to things that bounce? It comes back down again. And so you see how you're being led to a particular course because of the metaphor. There's been other research which looks at how metaphors mediate between mind and body. So if you talk about chewing over an idea, people would actually visualize that. And so you can create an almost bodily reaction within them. And so this is, I see there's someone from Hampton's estate agents here today. Like if you talk about, oh, the property has a stream running past it, then people will visualize movement in it. You've actually brought a picture to life, rather than if you said, for instance, oh, it's bordered by a stream, then people would not get that visualization of movement. We all know how powerful images are in our minds, yet it's extraordinarily just how often we miss them. We miss these metaphors and we don't notice them. There's an example that I've had recently, which is that my daughter, who's just 4 years old, has been diagnosed as diabetic, and so she's having to have 4 injections a day, which, as you can imagine, you're 4 years old, it's a nightmare. It's really difficult. And I just noticed, she's getting used to it now. We're kind of like 2 months in, but I noticed that all of the language about injections was so vicious. And it was like, we've got to give her a shot. We've got to give her a jab. And you're getting the needles out. And this is terribly aggressive language to be using on a 4-year-old child. And it was no wonder she was hiding under the table like this. And my wife, fortunately, is a comms nerd like me as well. And so we said, we're going to stop talking like this. We're going to stop using that language. And we now talk about giving her insulin. And I'm not going to pretend that this is the whole difference, but she is now far more relaxed about him. And as you would be when you think about how these ideas just plant in our minds. And it's like, oh my God, I've got mummy and daddy looking to shoot me. Of course, great businesses know all about metaphor. And metaphor creeps into all of the best businesses. I'm just going to look at 3 fields in particular. I'm going to start with mobile phones, which are obviously the big thing at the moment. We've all probably got one in our pockets, and we may not be aware that we actually have a metaphor in our pockets. And just taking the big ones one by one, Apple. What a great metaphor this is, and it runs throughout Apple's products, and it's connected to all sorts of ideas about the tree of knowledge and human progress, all of these different associations being activated in us. And Steve Jobs was very careful to ensure that the metaphor ran throughout a number of their products. And so I don't know whether many of you would know, for instance, that the Macintosh is a type of apple. And it's a type of apple that everyone eats in North America. It's very common in North America. It's very healthy. And so these kind of associations are being associated. You look at BlackBerry, okay? The idea that's coming out there in BlackBerries, apparently they thought about this very, very carefully, and they were very concerned about that, are people actually going to want these things in their pockets where they're being bothered by their boss all night long? How do we overcome that? Oh, we need to make it seem like the user is in control. So let's suggest it's like snacking on it. Let's get this idea across, that it's snacking on it. And apparently the work in progress name for a long while was strawberry. But they then thought, this is too big. A strawberry is too substantial. A blackberry is just about right. And then you get Google. Google, all of Google's language is mathematical, Nexus and so on. But with the operating systems for the Android, they've gone for names which aren't quite as healthy, but are nevertheless food. And so their operating systems have been called Cupcake, Donuts, Eclair, Gingerbread, Honeycomb, and just activating all of these ideas all of the time. And how valuable is this? Well, Apple paid $500 million to the Beatles, Apple company, for full rights to use the name. And I can well imagine that there's someone somewhere in the comms department at BlackBerry who every time people call them crackberries is actually having a complete seizure. So that's looking at mobile phones. What about if we have a look at a field like financial services? And there are a lot of people from different financial institutions here today. Well, what are the big metaphors going around in that space? Well, the first one, I think, when we're talking about the financial crisis, we talk about it as if it's an economic storm. I've got a quote here from a Mervyn King speech just recently. He said, "The economic sky has darkened. The storm clouds coming from the euro area have not yet lifted. And in other parts of the sky, new clouds have drifted over." This metaphor is very interesting because it asks us to accept that the financial crisis was, like African nationalism in the 50s and 60s, a force of nature. And so it wasn't the fault of timid politicians or inept regulators or greedy bankers, perish the thought. It was just an act of nature that came sweeping in. And it's extraordinary because this is the metaphorical frame which has been used everywhere. It's used in the papers, it's used by politicians, to the extent that even the critics of the banks and the regulators accept this metaphor and use it. So Vince Cable, who's probably the biggest critic of the banks and the regulators during that period, his whole book analysing the thing was called The Storm. Whereas, of course, a better metaphor where you're wanting to say, well, this was the fault of human failure, would be actually to use a metaphor from a field where there was some human control and failure. So something like architecture or design. So the whole edifice came collapsing down or something like that. So that's one metaphor in finance. Another one, which you see all over the place, is capital is water. And so we talk about liquidity, and we talk about credit flows, and we talk about the taps being turned off, and we talk about a drought. And this is an idea that you see all over the place. And of course, the suggestion from this is very interesting because it's saying to us that capital is on a par with water. That's how important it is. So if we don't have it for 2 days, we're all going to die. And so, my God, we must get the financial institutions running again and capital flowing properly through our system because otherwise we're all going to perish in 2 days. The next metaphor you get running through is financial institutions as if they're people. And so, of course, financial institutions, they're memorandums and articles of association, which are registered at Companies House. They don't actually exist, but we talk about the heart of companies and we talk about their DNA, and you think about the listening bank, you think about the bank that likes to say yes. We're kind of endowing them with human qualities, which makes us care about them and makes us feel about them as if they are human beings. Let's take another industry, cars. You think about all the animals names that run through cars, from the Beetle to the Bronco to the Stag, or the Ferrari logo, which is a black stallion, which is quite interesting because it's a metaphorical idea which is also used by Anne Summers. Lamborghini, I'll just leave that one to Cecil. Lamborghini has a bull in its logo as well, and so you see animals coming out there, and this is Animals for Journey. So all of these, I think they're fascinating. They're fascinating metaphorical ideas. A, because they're powerful, but B, I think the other thing which is interesting about them is they're absolutely timeless. Okay, they tap into an element or elements of what it is to be human that you could identify at any point in history and at any point in the world. You know, we have always loved to eat fruit, okay, and always will do. We've always needed water, and man has always had an urge to control animals as well, and indeed to use them to travel on across the earth. And so these are metaphors which are beautiful, exquisite, elegant, but of course for every apple there are several billion turkeys. And this is what we see most of all, I imagine, in our day-to-day work. And certainly for me, being a speechwriter, my job is often to wade through these horrible long reports and desperately try and come up with the little apple of an idea that might be sitting in there. But let me just give you an example and just listen to the metaphors going on in this, if you can bear to. I need a deep breath. Corporate strategic planning is the process of devising a plan of offensive and defensive actions intended to maintain and build competitive advantage over the competition. For strategy to be successfully implemented, it must be linked and aligned to all aspects of operations through a method that addresses risks, manages financial constraints, and adheres to an ever-increasingly complex maze of legal and regulatory requirements. Regardless of your organization's size, industry, or business model, strategic planning and well-executed implementation play critical roles in establishing and maintaining long-term growth and profitability. This is all absurdly familiar to you, isn't it? And what image, if any, does it leave with you? It's a complete tangled mess, isn't it? You've got mazes in there, you've got walls in there, you've got building in there, you've got machines in there, and you're just left with the only image I think that comes to my mind is of a dog being sick and then eating it. Let me give you another example. In that example, incidentally, this is the front page of some leading management consultants, their website, when they are setting out their offer onto the world. Come in. Wouldn't you love them to come into your company? Let me give you another example. And this is, some of you might remember this. Well, those of you who are on Facebook will know it anyway, because Facebook sent this email to all of their customers around the world in about November last year, and it created enormous backlash with people concerned about privacy. And I remember seeing it on my Facebook feed on one day. About 12 people had posted about how terrible this was. And I went back, checked what they actually said in the email, and just listened to the metaphors going on in this, and you'll get an idea for why it might have made people feel so cross. These updates provide you with new tools for managing your Facebook messages. We deeply value the feedback we receive from you during our comment period, but have found that the voting mechanism created a system that incentivized quantity of comments over the quality of them. So we are proposing to end the voting component in order to promote a more meaningful environment for feedback. We also plan to roll out new engagement channels, including a feature for submitting questions about privacy to our Chief Privacy Officer. I'll stop there because on the title, Chief Privacy Officer, don't we know that just like in, you know, we know that in the Ministry of Defence, it's actually all about war. You know, Chief Privacy Officer, it means he's Chief Snooper, don't you? And so you see how this is making people feel, though, because the machine metaphor is the one that's rising up there, and it had a terrible backlash on the web, and they polled immediately afterwards, and something like 60% of people said they had little or no trust in Facebook. We all use it, but no one really trusts what they have. I'll give you another example, and this comes from the NHS. McKinsey have done a huge amount of work with the NHS over the last few years and have charged literally tens of millions of pounds for it. And a few years ago, there was a huge, this was front page headlines when this report was leaked, because it said that they'd identified £20 billion worth of savings, £20 billion. And so it was like, wow, how have they done this? You know, and so everyone went to read the report. I'm joking, of course. No one went to read the report. Everyone just read the headlines. If you did read the report, then you'd have seen what McKinsey charged tens of millions of pounds for. And it was really quite fascinating. Just get a load of this. And I've not randomly picked a paragraph here. This comes straight from the executive summary. This was page 1 in the PowerPoint presentation that was leaked. Achieving a step change in spend on health and healthcare services, can't even speak it, will require a compelling case for change, the use of formal mechanisms to drive through efficiency gains, deployment of WCC structures and processes, removal of national barriers to change, introduction of incentive schemes, and an increase in skills and capabilities to drive out costs. One sentence. We recommend a nationally enabled programme delivered through the SHAs and PCTs, you love that, don't you, to drive through efficiency savings. The DH should take direct actions to capture some opportunities, e.g. lowering tariffs, and should enable delivery by creating a compelling story, removing barriers, developing frameworks, tools, and embedding the drive for efficiency gains within existing mechanisms, e.g. WCC. I'm so glad they threw in that e.g. at the end. And I mean, frankly, if I was running the NHS and I'd paid tens of millions of pounds for that, I would ask for my money back. You will all recognise that language, though. And the thing which is interesting there is that the prevailing metaphor is the car metaphor. But it's not beautiful like the Ferrari and Lamborghini. Instead, it's ugly. And so this is really what I want to lay into for the rest of my lecture. And I'm here with a metaphorical sledgehammer, and I just want to smash these cars to pieces, because you see it all over the place. It's my rage against the machine. We talk about driving engagement, accelerating change, changing gear on innovation. We talk about applying the brakes, parking ideas, or even adding turbocharges. We talk about leveraging values, get into the nuts and bolts, and of course everything has to be pivotal. When things are going well, they might be running like clockwork, a well-oiled engine, or as smooth as an assembly line. And when things go wrong, they might run out of steam, break down, or there might be a spanner in the works. And if we need change, of course, what do? We issue a toolkit, or God help us, we step in and get management consultants to introduce business process re-engineering, which is actually the usual thing. And this language is common currency, but it actually has a terrible effect on people. And you feel it, you'll have felt it. Just, you might not have been able to pinpoint it, but just when I was speaking earlier, that it is saying to you, you're nuts and bolts within a machine. That is the direct consequence of this metaphor if you speak to people as if the company is a car. And so it's dehumanizing and it's debilitating. And a lot of the time, it proves absolutely self-defeating and self-destructive that you'll have a CEO trying to inspire people in his organization. He uses this language and they just come out and they won't come out and say, oh, I didn't like the metaphor he was using. But they'll just come out and say, you don't really feel valued. It doesn't really make you feel very special. You don't feel like you're a name here. It's the classic Orwellian. You feel like a number. It's like organisation man, or, you know, T.S. Eliot. What's the line? I had not thought death had undone so many. It's kind of that sort of thing. And you see it actually in people when they start speaking this language as well. That's perhaps the most shocking thing about it. It's not just the effect it has on audiences, but when you put words like this in someone's mouth, you can see them. The lights kind of flick out, and they'll talk, well, we've got this innovation drive going on at the moment, and it's got all of the passion and humanity disappears from them. This is a big issue at the Department of Health, and I worked I've been a business speechwriter for about 6 years now. I worked as a political speechwriter, working in Whitehall in various departments for a number of years before that. And it's a very strange job, because you kind of, when a reshuffle happens, you'll go with your Secretary of State and you'll just land in a department, and all of a sudden you've got to write a speech with really very little understanding or experience of the issue. And I remember being with Alan Johnson as his speechwriter when we landed at the Department of Health, parachuted into the Department of Health, might be a good metaphor, I think, actually, in 2007. And I remember going to these meetings and hearing all of these managers speaking in this appalling language about all of these different drives and all of these different toolkits they have going. I just didn't have a clue what anyone was talking about. And I remember coming out of this meeting and just saying to senior colleagues, saying, I didn't have a clue what anyone was on about. And he just turned to me and said, thank God, I thought it was just me. And he was absolutely right. And this is the trouble. There's almost a conspiracy of silence about this sort of thing. I think in the NHS, the metaphor is particularly worthy of examination because it's actually the cause of a lot of conflict within the NHS. There's a big difference between the metaphor that the managers in the NHS use and the troops use. You see where I'm getting to with this? That the staff, clinicians actually see what they do as being part of a war. And it's ironic, given the nature of what they do, but they will talk about the front line, and they'll talk about fighting cancer, and they'll talk about the war against obesity, that they have that frame of mind. And so they will speak using those kinds of expressions. And so when you have the managers then come in with all of their toolkits, this is what happens. This is what we don't see things the same way. You've got a metaphorical clash of metaphorical. It's getting Sir Humphrey-esque, this sentence, but you get the idea about it. And I think in the NHS it has a damaging effect because it then shapes how people feel about it. And the NHS is particularly tragic because you get people. It's a vocation. People go into the NHS because they are compassionate people and they want to do their best. And a lot of the time they just get broken down because the language, the metaphor, is part of the culture. And so to get approval within the culture, it helps if you speak the same way as other people do. And so everyone takes up this metaphorical frame, and I think it belies a number of the problems within the health service. When you look at all of the terrible cases there have been recently about Stafford and this awful case they had down in Morden where there was this guy who was begging for a glass of water and they wouldn't give him any water and they said he was being belligerent and he called the police and said, I'm being dehydrated. And the police, amazingly, actually sent people to the hospital to go in there and the doctors wouldn't let them into the ward and the guy died of dehydration. And this is just an organisation where the compassion almost seems to have been removed. It feels like that. And then the relatives went in to see the body and they were obviously grieving. And whilst they were there, and this was the source of a complaint, a nurse came over to them and said, have you finished now? We need to bag him up. This is just terrible. But you see, this is the way that your frame of mind, that metaphor, culture, behaviour, language, attitudes, actions, they all flow and they're all kind of connected within one another. So how did we get to this? Who's to blame? Who can be our bogeyman through this lecture? Well, I've found one. And he's a guy called Frederick Winslow Taylor, who some of you might know. He wrote The Principles of Scientific Management. I want to blame him and also Henry Gantz, because like Smith and Marx, these two guys have probably dominated management thinking for the last 100 years across the world, not just in this country. And the two of them, Smith and Marx, they had different approaches, they had different metaphors. Gantz and Taylor didn't have different metaphors, they had one metaphor, and it was that of cars as machines. And the two of them were engineers. And so this was their view of the world. And that view, therefore, came out in the way they expressed their ideas, which has affected the way that we now all feel about it now. And it's curious, so they would have come up with a metaphor not just because they were engineers, but also at the time they were writing, that they were writing between 1900 and 1920, which was when the car was just taking off, was just going into mass production. And also, I think the other reason why they used machine metaphors is they actually had a pretty low opinion of the human race, if I'm honest. And this is what we do. If we don't like things much, we will turn them into machines. And so, you know, you might say, when I found my speechwriting has been becoming a bit of a chore, I might say it feels a bit like a sausage machine, you know, or people might say their marriage has broken down if they're feeling depressed about it, or it's run out of steam. Your team might go through its MOT. If you see someone being a bit slow in a meeting, you might say, oh, we can hear the cogs whirring. This is what they do. And I suspect this was what was going on with Taylor, because I don't think he did like people very much. Here's a quote from Principles of Scientific Management, where the whole kind of premise of it was that people are lazy. And so he said, it's only through enforced standardization of methods, enforced adoption of the best implements and working conditions, and enforced cooperation that this faster work can be assured. And the duty of enforcing the adoption of standards and enforcing this cooperation rests with management alone. I can say without the slightest hesitation that the science of handling iron is so great that the man who is physically able to handle iron and is sufficiently phlegmatic and stupid to choose this for his occupation is rarely able to comprehend the science of handling iron. So there we go. Not so much our employees are our greatest asset, but more our employees are thick and lazy. But there is a genuine debate to be had here, because in different companies you're going to look for different people to do different things and at different times. And perhaps there are some companies who do see their employees like that. But I don't come across many. Every company that I've came across has had approximately similar values for the kind of things and behaviours that they expect in their staff, which is that they like them to be creative, they like them to be imaginative, they like them to have respect, all of these kinds of things. And yet you don't get any of that with the machine metaphor. And I think as well, the other thing about Taylor's theories, they were based in a time when people were more used to hierarchical structures, and hierarchical structures are melting away now, and you need a smarter way of getting people working for you. And I think a number of really big companies in this country have got that now. You know, you look at companies like Unilever or Glaxo, and my God, they have incredibly high engagement scores. Their staff are very, very engaged in what they're doing. They're not in the business of making money at all. They're saving the world, you know, and they have this, they're operating on this higher moral plane. And so you don't need this machine metaphor anymore. So what would be a better metaphor? Well, in the same way as I was arguing that people who don't like things very much will use the metaphor of it, X, as a machine, likewise, people who do like things a lot will naturally fall into the metaphor of personification. And so they'll talk about it as if it's a person. And so people who love their houses will talk about the character of the house, or they might talk about the kitchen as the heart of the house. People who love their cars might talk about taking her out for a spin. I love in Star Wars that you've got Harrison Ford at one point who says, I just feel I'm never going to see her again, to the Millennium Falcon. And you see it all over the place. Patriots will talk about the country. Cameron talks about Britain being on its knees, or Britain standing tall in the world. People who like a drink might have a cheeky pint, you know, you're personifying it. Or people who love nature will say, oh, the plants look a bit thirsty. You know, so that's what we do. We personify. A couple of ideas. Charles Brouwer, who's a bit of a hero of mine, one of the big ad men in the 50s and 60s, and he talked about ideas. A new idea is delicate. It can be killed by a sneer or a yawn. It can be stabbed to death by a quip and worried to death by a frown on the right man's brow. Don't you just get the feeling, don't you? This is baby, you know? Mary Portas, to the retailers in the room, talking about the high street in her report. High streets are the heart of towns and communities. Although some high streets are thriving, most have a fight on their hands. Many are sickly, Others are on the critical list and some are now dead. We cannot and should not attempt to save every high street, but my findings have led me to believe that unless urgent action is taken, the casualties will only continue to multiply. You get a big sense of passion coming through there. It's not necessarily the most rational piece of writing you've read in your life, but my God, you're transmitted a strong feeling. And it does at least have a clear single metaphor running through it, which is very different to the gobbledygook that I read to you earlier. I mean, I do it in speeches as well. I might say, if I really like a speech that I'm working on, I might say that it's got legs, or I might say the backbone is this, or at the heart of it is this argument. So we naturally do it, and it works very, very well because it is the one thing that everyone in the world can connect with. Personally, if I see a spanner or a screwdriver, I run a mile. I'm just not that kind of person. I barely can change a light bulb, you know. I'm just not that sort of person, and so I can't really connect with that whole toolkit argument. A number of other people can't. A number of us aren't practically minded. The one thing that everyone in the world can connect with is the experience of meeting other human beings and relating to other human beings, to other people. And so this is why personification is so powerful. There was a philosopher, George Hegel, who said, personification is an important strategy for making the world seem less alien. It's an important way of cultivating intimacy. And this is an important idea, isn't it, when we're talking about building customer loyalty or building employee loyalty. And it is something that comes naturally. I see it in my kids, the way that they will personify absolutely everything. So seasons and weathers are personified. So, you know, not just through Jack Frost, but the Easter Bunny and Father Christmas and all of that. And they will talk about, you know, they'll see energy in streams. And if nothing will make them laugh more than if I start having a conversation with the pepper pots or something like that, you know, at the dinner table. Or if they trip over and bang their heads, then I'll take the shoe that they've tripped up and start telling it off, and they completely get this sort of thing. And of course, this is the secret of Disney's success. It was bringing to life inanimate objects. It has a charm about it, doesn't it? You think about Beauty and the Beast, the teapot and the cup, or you think about Toy Story, Toys R Us, have someone here today. And you think about the way that the toys in there are literally brought to life through the prism of the cartoon. And we've done this throughout the ages. You think about the ancient gods, the pagans and all of that. And the other thing is that it works across cultures as well. The body is a metaphor that is used all over the place to describe different things. And so, for instance, we often talk about the Chinese having this notion of face, and we talk about it in a kind of snooty Western way. It's a very Chinese thing, this idea of face, and yet it's just as prevalent, that idea, in our own culture. So we might talk about a face-off, needing a face-to-face. We might talk about losing face. The metaphor, face, for human dignity is one that is just, it works across cultures. It's common across the human experience, something that everyone can relate to. So what might this mean at a practical level? Well, I think two things. Firstly, the personification of companies, which you find in people who love the companies that they work for, or the companies that they've founded. So Richard Branson talks about the Virgin spirit. He talks about Virgin's character. If you look at Steve Jobs, one of his most famous quotes, it's in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts. Thank God there was no engineering metaphor in there, hey? It would have made it sound completely different. And they might talk about the heart of the company, or the company's character or values, vision, our past, and just creating this idea, planting this idea. The company is a person, and therefore it's okay for you to connect with it. You see it in adverts, of course. You get it in the Michelin Man, you know, the little direct line insurance, the phone. And it works for me as a speechwriter, it's one of the things that I find is there's a conflict between the way, if you're a CEO, there's a conflict between the way you sometimes have to think about your company and the way you have to speak about it if you want to be a convincing communicator. So for them, it might be very helpful when they've got a company with 130,000 employees to think about it as a machine. And they can just think, we're going to shut that bit down. They're not thinking about, you see, they've got a blind side there. They're not thinking about the 20,000 people they're making redundant. If they were thinking about that, they might not be able to do it. They might not be able to do it so easily. And so it helps them to get through it. And so you can forgive them using the machine metaphor to think about it, but then, God forbid, they use it when they're communicating with people. They're giving an inspiring speech to their staff, and they carry on using that metaphor, because then you get what I was talking about earlier, the nut and bolt effect, the dehumanizing effect. There's one guy I wrote a speech for who was wonderful, actually, his company went through a very difficult time at the time of the credit crunch, and he said, well, the truth was we got flabby. That was the truth, and we needed to lose weight. And there are a lot of ways you can lose weight. You can go to Weight Watchers, you can go on the Atkins, you can get a gastric band inserted. Me, I went for amputation. And that said something about his values. He was talking to an audience of his peers, so I thought that was okay. You can look at the personification of products as well. And Steve Jobs, you could see the way he loved the products that he was selling. And they were not just people. They were, to be more specific, they were very beautiful women. And you could see by the way that he held them and the way that he stroked them, and of course in the language he used about them, that they were beautiful and they were elegant. And he did actually said at one point that he wanted to make the iPhone so beautiful that you'd want to lick the button. And I'll just leave you to ponder on what idea he might have been wanting to plant in your minds with that. I saw it in an advert literally coming here tonight, a Best Western ad, hotels with personality. And so again, turning their products, turning their offering and giving human aspect to it. Estate agents, me and my wife have probably viewed something like 100 houses in the last couple of years, and hopefully our search is now coming to an end. But my God, we've got really tuned into the way that different estate agents talk about things and the way that you can get a sense, do you really like this house or do you really not? And if people say the house has character, it has real warmth, it's ever so inviting, and it enjoys a beautiful outlook over the hills, then you know that they're really feeling it. And otherwise, if they're speaking in a far more functional way, you know that they're not connecting with it on that kind of level. And of course, what worse indictment of any property than to say that it is soulless or characterless. You couldn't get worse than that, so you're taking the character out. And what's interesting about this, another kind of side thing, is the way that metaphors shape our sensory experience as well. And so you see some of this being read across to the way that different products are designed. There's a terrific book that I read a while ago called Biology, which is biology, B-U-Y-ology, so the science of why we buy things. And that had this thing about the Mini Cooper in there that said that when we see the Mini Cooper, the car, the facial recognition parts of our brain are activated. So we're actually looking at it as eyes and a mouth and a little nose there. And so do you see how the design is creating the metaphor? There's something about it in houses as well, the typical thing about the house with the two windows there and then the door there for a mouth. And again, Apple is my reference point of choice. I'm reading this from an iPad, but the design of the first ever Mac, where you had the little disk drive at the bottom, which apparently they really thought hard about where that should go, and just looking a little bit like a human face. And so you see this going on all over the place. So this is the main point of my speech, really crushing the machine metaphor and moving it over to more human metaphors. I don't pretend that the human metaphor is the only metaphor to use, not by a long shot. There are all sorts of other metaphors that can be used for businesses, but as a simple kind of contrast between the worst of language and the best of language, I think that this works pretty well. And the struggle between man and machines has been a major theme of the 20th century. You think it's been played out in films like Terminator, and it's been played out in books, Brave New Worlds, and all of that. And I think now you can have a look at it in business language. And I feel a little bit like, you know, the Steven Spielberg film. It was his first ever film, Duel, where you've got the guy in the car and this huge lorry coming behind him. Whenever I hear this language about toolkits and drives or anything like that, I always feel a little bit like this guy. And so the next time someone approaches you with an engagement toolkit, tell them to put it down and follow their heart. And the next time someone tells you they're driving innovation, tell them to point their car elsewhere. It's a car crash. And the next time someone from McKinsey comes offering advice on how to make your company more efficient, tell them to rip off. Because this is the thing, that companies are not machines, they are people. And like people, you can dissect them all you want, but you will kill them in the process. And there endeth my rage against the machine. Thank you for indulging me. And if you've got any difficult questions, like Einstein, the man with the camera will answer them. Thank you very much indeed.